Now, with this newly added expense bucket class here, we're now ready to work on the actual chart. And for that, in the widgets folder, in the lib folder, I'll add a chart subfolder, and I prepared two new widget files, which you'll find attached to this lecture, chart.dart and chart.bar.dart. And you should download both and place them in your chart folder in the widgets folder. Now, these files are responsible for creating a chart widget, which then contains multiple chart bars. And I'll walk you through these widgets in just a second. You should make sure that in chart.dart, these imports work for you, so that you're using your project name here, and that you have the same folder names I'm using, widgets, models, chart, and so on. Of course, you also must use the same file names. And you should make sure that if you named your model differently, the expense bucket or the expense model, you update those names here in chart.dart. After all, errors should be highlighted if you have any in this file. If you followed along with the same conventions I used throughout this section though, this file should work fine for you. And the same should be true for chart.bar.dart. Attached, you also find a link to my complete current project snapshot, so that you can also compare the other code files to yours in case you're facing any errors with those newly added files. But what do these files do now? Well, first of all, let's use them. In expenses.dart, we want to replace this chart placeholder here with the new chart widget that we just added. So for this, we have to import chart.dart from the widgets folder, and they are from the newly added chart folder. So that import here must be added. And with that import added, we can use the chart widget here in this column. And we must set the named expenses parameter to our registered expenses here. So to all our expenses. Because in the chart.dart file, we're then actually getting those expenses and storing these expenses in a property. But I got a getter, a helper getter, which then creates these expense buckets. Using this newly added expense bucket class, on which we worked over the last lectures, to create different buckets for different categories, so that we have these 4 buckets that are needed to display these 4 bars, or up to 4 bars, in the chart. Because if we save everything now and force a reload, we should see this chart here. And if we switch to dark mode, which we of course also can do, this chart should also look good in dark mode. Yeah, so this also looks quite nice. But how is this being displayed? Well, we got these buckets here, as mentioned, which are generated in this getter, and this getter is in the end used down there in this widget tree to go through all these buckets and create these chart bars. Now this code here might look strange, though I have mentioned it before in this course already, but it's still worth repeating what this code does. As I annotated here, it's an alternative to the built-in map method. And you can use this code here in your widget tree if you're inside of a list of widgets. So if you're in a place where a list of widgets is required, like here for the children of a row. Then you can use this for loop here with a syntax that's similar to what I showed you in this expense bucket class in this getter here, where we also had such a for in loop. But if you're using it in a widget or in a place where a list of widgets is expected, you actually have no curly braces thereafter. Instead, you just have this for in loop like this to loop through a bunch of pieces of data. And then right below this for loop syntax here, you have the widget that should be created for every item in that list of data. So here I'm creating one chart bar widget for every bucket in my list of buckets. And buckets, keep in mind, is this getter here, where I return this list of 4 expense bucket instances. So I'm looping through these buckets here, and I'm creating one chart bar in this list that belongs to this row for every bucket. Now the chart bar has one fill parameter, which is set to a number. And the number is based on the total expenses in a bucket, So that is this total expenses getter being used here. So the sum of all the expenses that belong to a certain category divided by max total expenses. And max total expenses is actually a getter that belongs to this chart widget. In this getter, I go through all my buckets with another for in loop, and then I simply determine the highest total expense from all these buckets, so from all these 4 buckets in this case here. I do that here by taking a look at each bucket's total expenses, so the sum of all the expenses in that bucket, and if that's higher than the highest total expense I got up to this point, starting at 0, I take that bucket's total expenses as the highest amount of total expenses. And I'm doing this because in the end, in the chart, the goal of course is to put these different bars in relation to each other. And the bucket with the highest expense should have the tallest chart bar, and the other bucket's chart bars should be drawn in relation to that. So that's what I'm doing here with this getter. And I'm simply passing the division of the total expenses of a single bucket by the maximum total expense across all buckets to chart bar, because in chart bar we're using this fill parameter and this fill property here to set our chart bar height. And I'm doing this with a new widget, the fractionally sized box, which simply does not take a fixed height in pixels, but a height factor instead, which simply is a number between 0 and 1, and 1 means that it takes 100% of the available height, 0 means it takes 0%. And that of course is a very helpful widget for setting different chart bar heights therefore. Besides that, I'm not doing anything fancy, just setting some colors based on my theme, though here it's worth pointing out that I'm actually dynamically deriving whether we are in dark mode or not with help of this line of code, to which I'll get back in just a second. But other than that, I just got some default styling here. And in chart dart, I'm also not doing anything fancy besides setting these chart bars. I just got more widgets to also display these icons below the chart bars. That's what I'm doing with this row, where I'm mapping all my buckets to icons essentially, using my category icons map, which we created way earlier in this course section. This map here in expense dart in the models folder, I'm using that here to set the icons below the chart bars. And I'm also dynamically finding out whether I'm in dark mode or not here as well. So what's up with this line of code then? In Flutter, you can use the built-in media query class combined with auth context to get some information about the environment in which your app is running, so to say. And we'll see media query again in the next course section. Here we're using it to find out what the current brightness of the platform is, if it's dark or light, so if we're running in dark mode or in light mode. And I'm doing this because down here, I actually want to set different colors based on whether I am in dark or light mode. Of course, we can set up totally different colors in our themes, but here I'm actually using different colors of the generated theme color schemes, as you can see. Secondary in dark mode versus primary in light mode. And that's therefore another useful pattern to know. You're not limited to just setting some colors in your themes and then using those colors everywhere. Instead, you can set up those colors, but if you then have a case like we have it here, where in dark mode you want to use the secondary shade that was generated, whereas in light mode the primary color looks better, you can dynamically find out in which mode you're running with help of media query. And I'm doing this here in the chart dart file, but also in the chart bar dart file. Here I'm also dynamically deriving whether we're running in dark mode or not, to dynamically use a different color for the color of my decorated box here, which in the end defines the color of the chart bars. And that's therefore another theme-related pattern that's worth knowing, that you can use different settings based on whether you're using dark or light mode directly in the widget tree as we're doing it here with help of media query. And that's also how such a chart could be rendered. You also saw this for syntax here for outputting a list of widgets, which is similar to this for syntax we used here in a non-widget place. It's almost the same, but we don't have the curly braces here. And as mentioned here, it's simply an alternative to map when using it here in a place where a list of widgets is wanted. You see the alternative down there actually. Here I am using buckets map, and we could indeed replace this with for in here as well, just as we're doing it here. But that's therefore how we can add such a chart which works in dark and in light mode, and how we can in general build such an expense tracker.